Good morning. Welcome to USJI Week. I'm Kazuichi Uchida, President of USJI, US Japan Research Institute, and also the Vice President of Waseda University. USJI was established in March 2009, organized by 8 leading Japanese universities, and also financially supported by meaningful Japanese business societies. Our mission is to dispatch policy-related research and policy recommendation on global issues both the United States and Japan face. We have continuously held USJI Week twice a year in March and September. Last Friday, on February 22nd, our newly elected Prime Minister Shinzo Abe came to Washington, D.C. as a summit meeting with President Obama, and he gave a speech at CSIS. The title of his speech was Japan is Back. For the last 7 years, we have produced 6 prime ministers, namely Abe, Buda, Aso, Hatoyama, Kan, and Noda. Then Abe is back, returned. And however, there is a common understanding among Japanese peoples and even Americans that Abe administration is different from the predecessors. First, Abe administration will probably last at least several years. Coalition of Liberal Democratic Party and Communist Party hold the supermajorities in the lower house, and many prospect LDP will win the upper house election of coming July. And we'll have stable majority in both houses. And I understand LDP has learned important lessons and received valuable experience during the period of the opposition parties. And there's no internal conflict within ruling LDP. So political stability will be restored. And secondly, because of Abenomics, highly evaluated Japanese yen become normalized. Tokyo stock market price started to increase. A business society expects Japan's participation for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Also, our administration has declared to abandon zero nuclear power plants policy and will invest in clean and safer nuclear energy and develop alternative energy resources. People are now confident in economic growth and recovery. And thirdly, our administration will restore the US-Japan alliance, a foundation of Japanese foreign policy, much damaged by DJP administration, particularly mismanagement of the location of US bases in Okinawa by Prime Minister Hatoyama, much deteriorated relations with neighboring countries caused by territorial tensions over Senkaku, Takeshima, and Northern Ireland will be changed on the basis of political stability, economic recovery, and stronger US-Japan relations. And because of these background changes, this week, we'd like to dispatch new ways of thinking on the US-Japan relations in globalizing East Asian context. There are 8 events during this USJI week. We'll cover such topics as energy, food, climate change, disaster resilience, issues concerning the Korean Peninsula, the relation of US, China, Japan, and Korea on the regional securities, and the constructions of East Asian communities, evaluations of other administrations, growth and economic reverse strategy. I'm confident that these topics satisfy the needs and expectations of US researchers, academics, policymakers, and people in general. Today, we are very fortunate to have a symposium on the topics of understanding our challenges in energy, food, and climate change implication for the United States and Japan. And before the start of the symposium, I would like to ask the participants for permission to take your pictures or video recordings. And finally, I'd like to ask the moderator, Professor Gemma, to introduce this project. Thank you very much for your listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming to this seminar this morning. We really appreciate your taking time to participate in this fast seminar for the USJI week. We deal with challenges in energy, food, and climate change. We have been discussing these issues for the past 2-3 years in this USJI week. Situation hasn't been really changed regarding the efforts made to cope with energy and food security issues in relation to climate change. But we have a situation that new government has come in, the change of the government has taken place in the US, in Japan, and then leading economies in Asia, as well as the start of the second term for President Obama. So we have a new sort of a phase of coping with these challenges. So the aim of this seminar is to understand the current situation. And then also we'd like to share some of the research outputs conducted by leading scholars in this area. Leading scholars are not only from the US and Japan, but from Canada, Turkey, and then Israel too. So I asked the leading scholars in the world to come and then share their findings with us this morning. So without delay, I'd like to start the session with the presentation by Dr. Tokos Simler. She's a senior researcher in the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington, based in Washington, D.C. She's an expert in this area, especially dealing with food and nutritional security in relation to the energy security. She's the top leading expert in this area. So I'd like to ask you, similar to spend next 25 minutes or so to make her presentation. Thank you.
Good morning. So first let me ask, can you hear me now with this microphone easily? Because unfortunately I'll have to sit still and not be able to stand up while I'm making the presentation. So if you cannot hear me, just let me know. So thank you very much for coming today. The title of my presentation is Food and Energy Security and How to Balance Them in a Growing World. So just a brief outline of what I would like to talk about this morning. First, I would like to summarize a little bit about the integration of agricultural and energy markets that we have seen in the last decade. Then I would like to tie that to how this transformation in these two markets is affecting food and nutrition security, especially in developing countries. And finally, I would like to touch base briefly upon the US policy environment for all renewable energy, and then I will conclude. So agricultural growth and food security. So when we are talking about these two issues, there are two things that we will pay attention to. One of them is the supply side constraints, and the other one is the demand dynamics. So when you think about the supply side constraints, especially for the long term, we start with climate change, of course, and then there's water and land scarcity issues that we have been facing. and which we will continue to face in the near future. And all of them are tied in an environment of science and technology policy, because that policy is definitely affecting investment in agricultural research and then your productivity of the agricultural sector. If you think about the demand dynamics, the most critical one is the population growth. UN projections put world population at about 9 billion people by 2050. These are the medium or reference scenario projections. And we do observe income growth. We observe it not only in Asia and Latin America, but now in some African countries as well. And that's definitely changing the consumption patterns. And if you are combining income growth with the urbanization, you definitely see a dietary pattern change, which is affecting the food security of many nations. And recently, in the last decade, we have seen the biofuels sector growth. So this is just in more detail sources of the supply growth. So there are multiple ways. The first one is the intensification. So you can increase supply either through yield growth or cropping intensity. And when you think about extensification, that's through arable land expansion. But for that, you definitely need investment for conversion of land into agricultural production. And one other way is expansion of irrigated production, because that's going to increase the crop yields. But all of these sources of supply growth require public intervention and investment, and they are further complicated by climate change and its long-term effects, because you need to make a decision where to invest, for which crop to invest in, and what kind of investments you need to make. And climate change is going to definitely affect your decisions of how these investments are made. And in terms of the sources of demand growth, I have mentioned population. I have also mentioned income growth and urbanization. This is affecting the demand patterns because you are moving with higher income growth and with urban households, you are moving away from the staples and demand for staple crops like, let's say, sorghum in Africa or wheat and corn, to protein-rich goods, which is livestock basically. It's milk and meat and other dairy products, so that's definitely changing your demand side. And then all of these trends are happening in an environment of higher energy prices and higher energy demand. So I'm not an energy economist, I'm an agricultural economist, but I wanted to tie it to what is happening in the energy sector. So for that, I will benefit from the International Energy Agency's World Energy Outlook publication for 2012, because they are the energy experts, and I just want to a little bit describe what they are predicting to happen in the next decade, so just to give a sense of an outline for what's going to happen in the agricultural sector. So according to International Energy Agency, global energy consumption rises, with China, India, and Middle East accounting for a significant part of this increase. And the OECD energy demand barely increases, but there is a change in the pattern of demand. There's a shift toward natural gas and renewable energy. As you know, there's a recent rebound in US oil and gas production, and it is projected to continue with US becoming a major producer. Just to let you know, International Energy Agency projects US to be a net energy for oil net exporter, but if you look at the US Department of Energy projections, they just project net imports to decline. They do not project a switch, but this is the trend that's happening. And we also observe a steady increase in hydropower and rapid expansion of wind and solar power. Consumption of biomass for power generation as well as for biofuels is growing and is projected to grow into the future as well. But still, with all this progress, energy excess is still a significant problem for developing countries. Despite some progress, nearly 1.3 billion remain without access to electricity, and about 2.6 billion do not have access to clean cooking facilities. So it's not only about energy supply growth, but it's also about energy access that the consumers should have. And just to link it to the agricultural sector and what's happening in the agricultural sector, they definitely put some emphasis on the interaction between the water and energy sides. So they project water needs for energy production to grow at twice the rate of energy demand. So there's definitely demand increasing for water coming from the energy sector, and thus it is as becoming a more and more important criterion for assessing the viability of energy projects. So population growth, economic growth, energy demand growth, so you're always intensifying competition for water resources, and at the same time, with the agricultural sector growth, you will need more water for that as well. Now, if you look at all these new conferences and debates, so the world energy, agriculture, water nexus is now gaining more and more popularity, so there's always that water, energy, and agriculture nexus that's being mentioned in debates as well. So there's a water side to the equation as well. So when you look at the renewable energy, just to give you a sense of what's happened in the history, in 2010, we do have about 1.7 or so billion oil equivalent of renewable energy being used, and it's about 13% of global primary energy demand. So, and between 2010 and 2010, the share of traditional biomass out of total renewable energy fell very slightly, but at the same time, the share of biofuels being used in transportation increased. We do have growing electricity generation from wind and solar energy. And this is just to give you a sense of the numbers. This is world total energy consumption by region. Just pay attention to the blue one. I think it's non-OECD Asia, because that includes China and India, and look at how fast they are projected to grow. And this is by sector. So I just wanted to pay attention to the bioenergy and other renewables. So they are not the only sector that's growing for energy use, but they're growing fast as well. This is how much biofuels and renewable energy consumption is used by different sectors. There's industry, transport, and buildings. So for buildings, it's pretty high, because that's for electricity, but biofuels is growing in transportation sector as well. So this is just my snapshot of what's happening in the energy sector. And so let's try to link this to the agricultural sector, and then hopefully afterwards food and nutrition security. So as you're all aware, the world energy prices have increased rapidly in recent years. And at the same time, agricultural sector has become even more energy intensive, with diesel fuel and gasoline used for tillage, planting, transportation, and harvesting. And we have electricity use, LP gas, and natural gas being used in irrigation, and also for many other agricultural sectors. So there's definitely that intensification of energy and agriculture sector linkage. And how do rising energy prices affect agriculture? So for me, this is really a summary of all these linkages. So I identified three main points that I would like to focus on. The first one is the effect of energy prices on agricultural prices through the cost of production, transportation, and processing. And the second one is biofuels use, so diverting increasing amounts of land to the production of biomass-based renewable energy. And the third one is, again, kind of the cost of production, the direct increase in the price of fertilizers and pesticides that are being manufactured from fossil fuels. So I just put in here the fertilizer price and the crude oil price together in the chart. So it's not only the mean price has increased, but as you can see, there's also higher and higher volatility if you are going towards like the later years. So there's that volatility of the energy prices that's affecting the agricultural sector and introducing some volatility and some price shocks to the agricultural sector as well. And then the second thing that I mentioned was biofuel sector expansion. And generally, like, the focus is on corn in the US and sugarcane in Brazil. So they are, of course, the major producers, but it's not only these two markets that are being affected. This is just like a really short list of the different types of crops that are being used or that are being used in experiments in biomass-based fuel production. So you do have a lot of crops that are being tried out right now. And this is for the biodiesel. So almost all the vegetable oils are being tried. And just to give you a sense of like where the market is going, this is sugarcane, 1,000 metric tons of how much sugarcane is being used in ethanol production in Brazil. So they always had an ethanol sector going, so it's not a recent expansion, but you can see the levels increasing definitely in the last couple of years. and this is the grains and ethanol production. I just put in here the three smaller markets, China, EU, and Canada, but even in those markets you can see like the total is definitely increasing, and there's an upward trend, and this is US. So that's why I want to put it differently, otherwise it dwarfs all the other numbers. So this is corn and ethanol production in the US, and that's definitely creating an impact on the agricultural sector. So if you move on to biodiesel, this is EU, because they are the largest market. How much vegetable oils in total is being used in biodiesel? So that they do try a lot of different vegetable oils, and they import some, so this is just the total amount. And this is for other countries. Just to get your attention to Indonesia and Malaysia, because they do palm oil. So all of these things are, of course, when you tie them together, you see this connection between the food prices and the crude oil prices. This is a food price index, so it is like an average of different commodity prices by FAO. It's computed by FAO and it's updated monthly. So this is monthly data, crude oil price, which is US imported price, and this is the food price index. So they're on different axes, but you can see it's not only the level of the food prices, but also the volatility that you are seeing. So this volatility is definitely affecting the food and nutrition security concerns of developing countries. So it's not only the level of the prices, but other things as well. So let's try to link them now to what's happening for developing countries. And up to now, I talked about energy and agriculture, so they were just a little bit aggregate. So it's food and nutrition security, it's not only about agricultural sector and agricultural production, it's defined a little bit more comprehensively. So there is a World Food Summit in FAO in 1996. So it defined food security as existing when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food to meet their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. So when you talk about food security, it's a little bit more comprehensive about just having food or having access to food. You have food availability, stability of food supply, access, having consumers access to food, and utilization of food as well. So when you have a more comprehensive definition, definitely there are more factors affecting food and nutrition security, and what's happening in energy and agricultural sector are not the only factors. So I try to kind of categorize them to the best of my ability. So you have demand drivers and supply drivers. So there are different factors that affect the demand side, and there are different drivers that affect the supply side. And I try to kind of categorize them into long-term and short-term. So short-term is a little bit more about volatility. Long-term, for example, you definitely have there the climate change, the natural resource constraints, which are, of course, partly related to climate change, urbanization, population, and income growth and distribution. So income distribution is also a major factor that we are not always focusing on. We look at, oh, there's income growth, there's GDP growth, it's going to get better, but it's not always the same case. And I put in trade policy just in the middle because it's affecting the demand side and the supply side at the same time. So as you can see, energy prices are there, but they are on the demand side and the supply side in the middle, so it's affecting food and nutrition security through two channels. I have stocks there because of all the hoarding that has been done in response to the 2007-2008 food price crisis, and we have infrastructure and market access. So energy sector is there, but it's not the only thing. And there are much bigger constraints that we are facing to provide food and nutrition security for developing countries. And this is a little bit more on the food and nutrition security on a country level, a little bit more like, to give you a little bit more details to link to the energy market. So we have three channels that I mentioned before: the input market or fertilizer market, and that's affecting the agricultural sector through the supply side, so through land use, crop choice, and management policies. And there's biofuel markets that's affecting both crop and livestock markets because part of byproducts of ethanol production can be used as a feed for animals, so you have that channel. And at the top, I have transportation costs and market access. That's also related to energy sector and what's happening in the energy sector. So there three channels that at the country level that we can see. Again, this is a summary. I try to focus on the main channels, but you can definitely add more and more points to this when you're discussing the food and nutrition security linkage to the energy markets. And this is just the first part of the presentation that I focused on. I was also asked to just briefly discuss US policy environment. So I generally focus on biofuels. I do not know much about renewable energy and other sectors. So I'll try to give a brief summary. And when you look at the policy environment, so just to be consistent, I stayed with International Energy Agency. I did not use US Department of Energy projections. But you can see, just look at the red boxes, and those are bioenergy and other renewables. So there's a total final energy consumption increase. It's not that high, it's about 7% between 2010 and 2035, but there's definitely a change in the decomposition. So the share of oil declines, share of electricity increases, and share of the renewables increases as well when they are looking into the future for US energy sector. And this is how much US biofuels and renewable energy is used for different sectors. This industry, transport, and buildings. If you look at the green one, that's transportation. So that's the largest component in the US. But if you look at the world numbers, actually the buildings was so much higher. You know, so it's very different when you look at the global picture and the US picture. So if you think about the policy, this is just a little bit of the summary of the main policy, because there is so much at federal and state level. So both federal and state level policies push renewable energy in the US. There are renewable portfolio standards for electricity for many states, not all of them, but a lot of them. And you're all familiar with the renewable fuel standard of the US. That was the first one in 2005, and another one in 2007, so that's a pretty high mandate. And also they are also changing like other regulations. Before, when I first started working on this, you could only have E10 in the US, which is 10% ethanol and 90% gasoline. That was like the maximum, unless you had flex fuel cars. But EPA recently changed it to 15%, because there's so much ethanol production and there's not enough demand. And okay, you can put more in your car. So they're changing the regulations to create a little bit more demand. For biodiesel, they have an income tax credit and biodiesel mixture excise tax credit. And they have, actually, they were done. They just recently extended them till the end of 2013. There's also second generation biofuel producer tax credit that was also recently extended. There are solar tax credits so that are supporting. But at the same time, the sector has grown so much that they kind of deleted some of the policies. Ethanol import tariffs and tax credits were removed. Now there is Clean Energy Standard Act. It's considered by the US Congress. Now it's about electricity from renewable sources and how to increase that. So we don't know how it will go or whether there will be changes made to it. And if you look at implementation of renewable energy policy in the US, it's mostly done by EPA at the federal level. So that was the 2012 drought, and some of the states applied, saying, can we have a waiver for the RFS? And EPA said, no, you cannot. So there wasn't, they said there's enough supply for you. But for the cellulosic ethanol, for the second generation ethanol, they definitely reduced the obligations under the RFS for 2010, 11, and 12. And probably they will do that in the future as well, because it's not growing. So all these blending requirements and everything, to do that, they generated this system called Renewable Identification Numbers. So that's also being regulated by EPA. For second generation, there's not much growth yet, but there's a lot of R&D in this program. There's also a lot of grants and support system. So I just put in there the three major ones: biomass crop assistance program, biorefinery assistance program, and bioenergy program for advanced biofuels. And I kept mentioning the RFS just to give you a sense of the volumes.
So this is big in gallons. So you can see the cellulosic one is pretty high, but they're waiving it constantly. And this is the latest US Department of Energy outlook. The green one is the implied mandate, and the red one is what the Energy Information Administration is thinking that would happen. So they are really, really below their targets, but for the second generation biofuels. So that's just a summary of the US renewable energy. So if no further questions, let me just start my conclusions. So higher demand will increase pressure on limited natural resources. So there will be an effect on land, water, environmental preservation, and biodiversity. We have observed this strengthened linkage between energy and agricultural markets, both globally and also on a local level. And I think the volatility in energy markets is being transferred to agricultural markets, and that's definitely negatively influencing to the nutrition security concerns of developing countries. And so there has been the biofuels, there has been this debate about food versus fuel trade-off. So that trade-off is going to increase if there aren't enough innovations and technology investments in crop productivity. And the reliance is based on first generation or conventional biofuels. But if there is effort and R&D dedicated towards improvements in biofuel conversion technology and crop productivity, we will definitely eliminate or reduce these trade-offs. And R&D funds allocated to second generation biofuels or other renewable energy options would ease this trade-off in the long run as well, but that's a really, really, really long run solution. And adopting a low carbon fuel standard like the one in California would shift ethanol production away from grains and towards lower carbon feedstocks. Indirect land use change has gotten a lot of attention regarding biofuels. So it's an additional environmental consequence that policy needs to factor in, and a lot of the countries are doing it, like the EU Commission is doing right now. And investment policy applications. So you can overcome higher agricultural prices if resources are diverted to efforts aimed at crop productivity growth as well as investment in irrigation. And this requires renewal of the attention paid to agricultural research and technology, extension services, and rural infrastructure as well. And thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you have any questions regarding, well, like a classification questions? I can just we can ask her before we move forward to the next presentation. All right. I see two hands over there, so may I ask the lady first?
Yes,
Sorry. Come over here.
Thank you. I was wondering regarding U.S. policy, can you talk, do you know anything about the trade of Brazilian sugarcane ethanol in the U.S. and corn ethanol back in Brazil and kind of that exchange and what it means for climate and energy?
Okay, so let me touch base a little bit about the market structure, but I'm not an expert on climate and energy, so I don't want to touch that topic. So basically, Brazil was a major sugarcane producer, and they were the largest producer of ethanol. But I think, so nearly like half of the sugarcane went to ethanol, the other half went to sugar. But there was a sugar price increase, and recently a lot of the sugar cane was diverted to the sugar production rather than ethanol. So they started importing, and also I think US exported to Brazil as well. So the trade situation has changed. Before, Brazil was exporting to US through the Caribbean countries. So there was a high import tariffs in US. They had the tax credit for blending. But because of the change in the Brazilian market and what happened in the sugar market, the trade situation reversed and US exported to Brazil. But I don't know whether that's going to be a long-term thing, because with the change in the sugar market, they will just revert back. So it was just like a temporary thing, in my opinion. But regarding the climate and energy, it's not something I'm an expert at, so maybe not so much. But indirect land use change is always a concern, but there are lots of issues when you're computing that, or when you're computing greenhouse gas emissions. There's a lot of debate, a lot of models are being used, so I think we'll just wait for the literature to kind of further explore that. So there's a lot of debate about it.
Okay, Professor DePorta, discussion.
I'd just like to follow up on your question. The United States and Brazil have been importing and exporting ethanol. Okay, so the United States was exporting ethanol to Brazil for about a year and a half, and Brazil always exports ethanol to the United States because of the low carbon fuel standard in California, which requires Brazilian to have a lower carbon footprint than U.S. corn ethanol, and also because of the advanced corn ethanol mandate. There's 4 different mandates. One is conventional, and then there's another one called advanced, which is non-cellulosic, and Brazilian ethanol applies to that mandate. So, but the United States stopped exporting ethanol to Brazil in May of last year. But Brazil continues to export the United States because of those 2 reasons. But now, the reinstatement of the biodiesel also applies to the advanced ethanol mandate. And because of the reinstatement of the dollar tax credit, that now acts. We already have a mandate for biodiesel in the United States. We have a high biodiesel price in the United States because of the mandate in the U.S. Because you've reinstated that tax credit, it now displaces Brazilian ethanol imports into the United States because they use that money to keep the biodiesel price lower than the
definitional question. You used the phrase access to clean cooking facilities. Is that equivalent to open fire cooking, or is that something else?
I'm not so sure, but probably. I think so, but I'm not an energy economist, so I'm not sure about that.
I'm surprised the number was 50.6.
Okay, we can discuss more detail after finishing the presentation. So I'd like to invite Professor Jacob too to make his presentation on climate change. We seem to, when Obama administration came in and then when the Democratic Party of Japan took power in politics in Japan 3-4 years ago, we started talking about how we deal with climate change issues, and then, but now, with the prolonged recessions, we don't have enough budget to do anything with the climate change, reduction of the CO2 emissions. Now, our attention has been shifted to more how we deal with climate change, how we make adjustment to the climate change problems. So his presentation is what academics have been doing regarding this adoption process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. This is my second time I'm invited, and it's a great pleasure. My talk will be, this is based on a joint work with a colleague from the Netherlands, Case Wittingen, and I'd like to address a rather methodological, conceptual issue regarding climate change, and the question we ask in this work, is if you, those of you that follow a little bit the policy literature regarding climate change, just to prominent examples is the Stern report or review that was published in 2007, and the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It is published every 5 years. I think the next one is due to appear soon. They concentrate on how to, the mitigation, the prevention, how to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases so that not enough of it accumulate in the atmosphere and causes the changes that we are so afraid of or like to avoid. And not much attention is given to other means or other type of policies. In fact, not hardly any attention is given. And this is what we call here the adaptation. So if climate change occurs and with the consequences and ensuing damages that it will cause, how should we prepare for it? So there are two different issues here. Well, two different sides of the same coin, of the same policy. One is invest our efforts and resources in trying to prevent the process from occurring and with its devastating potential consequences. The other one is assuming that we will not be successful in preventing it. Should we invest some of our resources, and to what extent, in preparing ourselves for it? And this is what we call adaptation. So most of the debate, most of the policy debate and literature is centered and focused on mitigation, preventing the process. Here we want to look at what we call adaptation, preparing for it. No matter what, if we do whatever we do, we may eventually end up having to bear the consequences of global warming, of climate change. What is the best way to prepare for it? And so what I'd like to present here is some kind of a framework, methodological framework of how to approach this policy problem. And toward the end, I will try to tie the two together, though there's still a lot of work to be done. So I will discuss the way I see it, what needs to be done. So my talk will be, as I said, somewhat conceptual about this issue. And I will try to avoid getting into the details, although there's some details on the presentation, but I will skip those details. I'll give you just the main ideas. So we can look at examples of what we call adaptation. Is a country, for instance, that stand to lose or to get damaged from possible consequence of climate change, say a possible rise in sea level, like plain countries like the Netherlands or Bangladesh, can invest, instead of using its resources in lowering greenhouse gas emission, can invest in building dikes that will protect it when and if the climate change occurs. Countries that are on the edge of the desert can prepare themselves for another possible consequence of climate change, and this is desertification of certain areas. So the country where I come from, for instance, Israel, just half of it is plain desert and half is semi-arid or more wet area. And what happens if the desert now moves northward and captures 2/3 of it? How should we prepare for it? And there are many, many more examples. So the issue of why we should worry about it, about this issue at all. We have to realize that climate change is a global phenomenon that will affect different countries in very different ways. Some countries will in fact benefit from it. Many countries will damage from it. But even those that will damage in different ways. So there are certain incentives for various countries for proactive actions and policies for preparing themselves in different ways. Mitigation or lowering or reducing the emission of greenhouse gases is global phenomenon. It will affect each country that does this, affect the process of climate change in more or less the same way. But the consequences will affect each country differently. As I said, some countries will even benefit from it. So there's this inherent motive and incentive for countries to behave differently here. And by trying to convince all the countries to follow a global policy such as reducing greenhouse gases, we witness how hard it is by following if you just look at the certain international treaties and how hard it is to reach the agreement, and how hard, after we reach the agreement, how hard it is to implement it. If we look at, for instance, what happens to Kyoto, the Kyoto Protocol. And the main reason is that there's an inherent incentive here for countries to free ride, to invest the resources on other means rather than on the global good, in this case, reducing emission. So, but if we look at the policy of adaptation, there each country is more or less on its own, based on the damages that it expects are likely to occur in its territory, and there is a built-in incentive for each country to invest in proactive action and proactive policy. So how to do it? How to go about? And then this paper deals with build a kind of conceptual model that how to build a proactive policy of preparing, how to prepare ourselves to potential damages of climate change. So what we have to do, well, first of all, we know that there's a lot of uncertainty involved. We want to incorporate that. If we would know for sure, for certain, if we would know for sure the consequences of climate change, then the situation would be relatively easy. But there's just a lot of uncertainty both on the process itself and on its possible consequences. And we have to take that into account when we model climate change and policy, best response to climate change. And the way to do it, well, there's different ways to do it. If you look at the literature, there's just many approaches and methods to do it. The way I think captures the essence of the uncertainty associated with climate change, and you cannot capture everything. You have to simplify if you want to model it in any way. Is by assuming, well, first of all, that the effect of climate change will come in what we call abrupt way, abrupt climate change. or in a different term, I can use a catastrophical. It would be an event that will strike not over a very long period. Once it starts, it will be very hard to reverse. And this process like that we call abrupt changes or catastrophic events. So first of all, we want to look at an event that we're not going to get much warning. Because if we get warning, it becomes much easier. We say, well, let's wait and see. We get warning, we operate. If we don't get the warning, we just sit and do our stuff, and then everything will be okay. But that's not the way it will happen. We will have to look at the So one way to look at it is abrupt change, catastrophic event. And the other issue is the time, the time at which this event occurred. So we have two types of uncertainties here. One is if you look at catastrophic or abrupt changes, then the magnitude of the damage due to the abrupt change, this is one uncertainty. And the other uncertainty is when the time in which it will occur. It may occur 20 years from now, it may occur 50 years, it may occur 200 years from now. And this is a very important type of uncertainty. So these two types of uncertainties, we capture this in this model. And we give some literature that leads to this model shows how to model this type of uncertainty. And so we have the date, okay, the date in which the event occurs. We look at some catastrophic event, think of a rise in the sea level, think of the outburst of a disease or of some pathogens that affects crops in certain areas, certain territories. And we want to invest in capital that allows us to deal with it. So if we look at rising sea level, we want to build aqueducts. If we think of outbursts of disease or pathogens, we want to increase our know-how, our knowledge of how to deal with these pathogens. So we want to build our capacity to deal with a problem once and if it will occur. Okay? And this is what in economists usually call this capital, okay? And it can take different forms. It's very general in this framework that I present here. So we have capital, we want to know, but if we invest in capital, we invest our resources. We can consume it, we can use it for infrastructure, we can use it for building schools, education, healthcare, and so on. So the trade-off here, how much we want to invest in this type of capital that will help us deal with the consequences of climate change if and when it occurs, because we take it away from what we consume today, from our consumption today, from whatever we do today, in order to benefit future generations. And because the time here is very important, we're not dealing with 5, 10, or 40 years, we may be dealing with much longer period. This abrupt change may occur in 50, may occur in 100, and may occur in 400 years. We look at it, and it can be devastating if it occurs. So we want to invest, and we have to invest in, we have to prepare ourselves in advance. We want to know how much today we are willing to invest and put aside so that our grandchildren, grand-grandchildren will not suffer or will suffer less from the consequences of our actions today. Okay? Now I'm going to skip some. So we build a model. I'm not going to go into the details, but the main problem we're dealing with is how much to consume. By consumption, I mean everything that we do today, including healthcare, education, infrastructure, everything. How much we do for the sake of the present generation, for ourselves, and how much we put aside, we invest in order to build the so-called capital that will help us deal with the climate change problem once and if it occurs. And we don't know if and when it will occur. It is uncertain. We know it can be devastating. We don't know to what extent. So there's these two types of uncertainties that are all built in this framework. Okay? So this gives kind of the main ingredients of the model here. Everything is here. And then I'm going to skip some equations. Well, this is tells us the welfare. If we look at the welfare due to our action, the result of the policy, and we have what will happen from now until the event occurs. Capital T is the time at which the event occurs. Remember, it is uncertain. And then what will happen after the event occurs, after the catastrophic climate change occurs. All this uncertainty taken into account, we take some expectation and we get what we call economics objective function, we maximize it and we get the optimal policy. Okay, that's what we do. And this gives us optimal adaptation policy. How should we invest over time in preparing ourselves for potential devastating climate change if and when they will occur, taking into account that they may occur 50, 100, 200, maybe 400 years from now. We don't know. And basically what we find is the following. There is a level of capital, of the capital that is preparation capital for climate change, which is the optimal level that we should build our capital toward it, should invest so that we reach this level, but not immediately. We should do it gradually. Okay, and this diagram. Here we have the level, the capital know-how, or the types we invest in, whatever, for each country it is maybe different. This is, we actually are able to identify the level of the optimal level of capital we want to reach eventually in order to prepare ourselves for the potential consequences of climate change. So this is, we identify this optimal level. Moreover, we identify and we characterize how we want to get there. We don't want to do it immediately because it may imply that we invest too much in the near term. And we also characterize. We also characterize how we want to approach this optimal level of capital that prepares ourselves to the possible consequences of climate change. So basically, that's one part of the paper. So it deals with find the problem, build kind of conceptual model, solves it, and tells us what is the best policy, how we should proceed in this. If we choose to invest our resources in preparing ourselves for climate change rather than trying to prevent it. Okay. Then we do the second part of the paper does some extensions, which I will skip, looks at what happens when under different types of uncertainty. Again, uncertainty is a major concern here. And looks what happens for countries that grow, growing countries, because this would allow us to look differently at the incentives of developing countries versus developed countries. And what we find is interesting. We found that on the one hand, the more developed the country is, more wealthier, the stronger is the incentive to invest in preparing itself for the consequences of climate change rather than investing in preventing it. So it explains some of the reservation of developed nations that they have on investing. You know, if those of you that are familiar a little bit with the Stern Review, one of the main conclusions of the Stern that each country, the economy as a whole should invest between 1 to 2% of GDP in mitigating emission, trying to avoid the process of climate change. But it has been extremely hard, complicated to implement it. And here we explain why it is, because there is a real motive and incentive for rich countries, for wealthier, developed countries, to spend more resources rather than on mitigation, preventing the process, rather to spend the 1 or 2, whatever percent of GDP on preparing for possible consequences. So the more rich the country is, the stronger is the incentive. This is important to understand when we try to deal with how to design international treaties. We have to understand this type of incentives. The other important finding here is that we see how this optimal level of capital that we want to build in order to prepare ourselves changes with the different parameters of this framework. And one parameter is the sensitivity of the economy for climate change. And we know that economies that are developing economies, nations, that depends on the economic activity is more dependent on agriculture, for instance, stand more to lose, will be much more sensitive to possible consequences of climate change. And as a result, there's also increased incentive for these economies to do more of an adaptation policies. So if they decide to invest some of the resources in climate change policy, they have higher and larger incentive to invest it rather in adaptation rather than in, as I said before, mitigation. So however we look at it, we see that the mitigation policies need to be designed in a very careful way. And everything that is discussed in the international realm deals mostly with mitigation, with reducing greenhouse gas emission. And this points to some real issues that needs to be, this type of analysis points to real issues that needs to be accounted for. And I think, for what from my experience and knowledge, have been, to a large extent, have been overlooked. And they may explain some of the problems we encounter when we try to design and tailor and craft international treaties that will provide the right incentives. So I think I'll stop here and just move to the conclusion. So there are many parameters that affect the whether and how a country should proceed with preparing itself to possible consequences of climate change. And I discussed a few and pointed to the problem, those incentives associated with both for developing and for developed nations in actually preferring the adaptive policies rather than the preventive policies. And finally, so I think that the real challenge, and this has not been done, at least to my knowledge, is is to actually look at both types of policies, preventive and adaptive policies. Try to understand the overall forces that are in play here. And this has not been done to the best of my knowledge, and I've been working on this issue for over 20 years. And this, I think, will be crucial, will be necessary if we want to come up with international, with global policy to deal with climate change, which is a global phenomenon. So the main message from this is that the issues associated with adaptive policies, preventive policies that are specific to each country have been, to a large extent, have been overlooked, and I think play an important role in undermining international treaties and international efforts that are mostly based on preventive policies, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Thank you.
Okay, again, if you have any clarification questions, quick questions, we can accept. Message was sort of clear that adaptation efforts are as important as the mitigation efforts. And then our international collaboration efforts have been more oriented for mitigation rather than adaptation. So his model studies show that we need to, well, the benefit exists for the adaptation efforts. Right. So thank you, Professor Tu. We would like to have Professor Harry Ekorov, professor at Cornell University, to make comments on these two presentations, as well as discuss both implications for the North American economies of the United States and Canada. Thank you.
Difficult for me to make comments on such comprehensive papers, very different. Simla Tagas has certainly proven that she's the expert on biofuels and agricultural products. Very, very interesting and broad-ranging presentation. I learned some stuff just sitting there. And Jako's very, very different type of paper. Again, 20 years of working on global climate change shows up in the very, very in-depth analysis he undertakes. I hope your new Prime Minister can understand that one diagram. I don't know if our president can. I will just say a couple of things about Jaco's paper first, and then I will talk towards Simla's. Maybe the paper title of his paper should be How to Prepare for Global Climate Change If You Must. Then I said, well, you must. You must adapt. There's no choice, is there? Nordhaus says, mitigate we might, adapt we must. Then others argue that you have to do both. Others mitigate and adapt. But I think that's what Jaco was saying at the very end of his presentation. We have to analyze both at the same time. Analyzing one at a time is complicated enough, so I can imagine how I don't want to be commenting on that paper. Don't ask me to comment on that paper, please. Very, very interesting and very powerful message. I just have a couple of questions. How do you value a ton of CO2 equivalent before the Greenland ice cap is in the ocean compared to a ton the day after? All right. And so some effects are irreversible. I still don't understand your model of how you actually take. You say you just look at the discount rate and the price of carbon is rising over time. I wonder if that's the right model. If you look at the green paradox literature, the price of carbon has to be very high at the beginning and go down over time. So I wonder if there are other models out there that can better capture it. But again, that's just a question I want to lay out for discussion later. Maybe individuals in the audience have a better idea of those issues than I do. Simla's paper is about biofuels. So biofuels is all about mitigation, okay? Mitigation, and Yakov outlined two big problems with mitigation policies. The first problem is free riding. You cannot get cooperation amongst countries to mitigate because everybody's contribution to mitigate helps everybody equally. Whereas adaptation is private, and so you have incentive to do your own adaptation. The second shortcoming that he outlined, or insight, I guess you could say, is that rich countries have an incentive to adapt more so than poor countries, and vice versa for mitigation, presumably. I don't know if that follows naturally. But I think in terms of biofuels, or as an example of mitigation, again, I'm just connecting Jaco's ideas to Simla's paper, that biofuel suffers from other problems. Biofuel suffers from the fact that first disadvantage of biofuels is that it competes with food. That's the first disadvantage that's unique. But the second disadvantage of biofuels is that we have what I call leakage, okay? That you have leakage, not just the free riding problem between countries, but leakage within your own country. Market leakage. In other words, if you add biofuels to the economy, then the price of fuel goes down, and you will therefore consume more fuel. And fuel is a mixture of biofuels and gasoline. And so there's leakage in the domestic economy. So those are the two disadvantages of biofuels above and beyond what Jaco emphasized. Now, the current literature on biofuel policies just focus on two, what I call static leakage, okay? I mean, not taking into account intertemporal response of oil producers. And the two kinds of static leakages are related to market leakages. In other words, the first one is indirect land use change. And Simla talks about indirect land use change. All that indirect land use change is if you have biofuels and the price of food, production of corn. And so that offsets the CO2 reduction effect of the initial level of biofuels. It's just a market leakage. But we also have another leakage, we could call that indirect output use change, and that is the effect of biofuel policies in fuel markets with a decrease in world oil prices. And this is not a free rider problem, this is a problem within the domestic economy too. It's not a problem just between countries, it's both. Okay, so you have market leakage of location that occurs domestically, and it occurs internationally or spatial. And what Yakov talked about was just the spatial component of the problem of mitigation. And then you have also leakage in the form. You have it in terms of market leakage, how many gallons of gasoline is not replaced by ethanol, and also the carbon leakage, how much carbon is not saved by biofuels relative to that intended. Okay? So I'm just going to show you one little simple supply and demand diagram to get the idea across, and then I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to look at a few slides on the other issue of biofuels and food prices. So one slide on this leakage component that neither paper looked at, and that's a problem for all renewable energy, renewable electricity as well. Okay, so life cycle accounting, assumes that 1 gallon of ethanol replaces a whole gallon of gasoline. Is that true? And if you look at, press the right one, here's a supply of demand for fuel. Fuel is defined as gasoline plus ethanol, and here's the supply of gasoline, which is, you can look at it as almost the supply of oil. And then you have some production of ethanol that shifts the supply of fuel to the right, but the price of fuel goes down, and you consume more fuel. That's pretty standard. But the problem is that everybody assumes that the gasoline declines by this full amount. The full amount of the biofuel increase reduces the gasoline, but that's not true because we have distance A is the only distance by which gasoline is replaced. Distance B, gasoline is displaced. And this is not just spatial, this is also in the domestic economy as well. So this is what I'm emphasizing as the problem of leakage in its many dimensions. Now, the leakage that I omit here, there's one more leakage. And again, that's unique to biofuels. Okay? There's yet another leakage. And that I call intertemporal leakage. And you don't have to look at the slide so much, but if you have biofuels, you can think of that as a tax on oil. And if you tax oil, what are a finite resource like oil is, what are the producers of oil going to do? If you tax oil, the value of their oil in the future has now gone down. So what are they going to do? They're going to extract more oil today. And so they're going to offset the carbon emissions effect of the biofuels production. So, and this is extremely important concept, I think, that we have to keep in mind, that biofuels is different in terms of mitigation efforts, and you're going to have other problems that could occur. Okay, so if I allow 2 more minutes, 2? Okay, can I do this in 2? I have to get down to the bottom here, sorry. As you can see, I have lots of green paradox slides if you want to see them. Okay, so what are the effects of biofuel policies on food grain and oilseed prices? And what I'm going to show you here is just diagrams. There's no proof in diagrams, right? Data can lie and all that. Statistics lies. But here, I want to show you 33 months of prices from January 2004 all the way to September 2006. Here's the corn price. And here's the oil price. The green is the oil price, and as you can see, oil surpasses, early on in this period, oil surpasses $40 a barrel, which is a very big watershed event, back then. And blue is MTB, is the ethanol price, and when we had that regulatory environmental policy, and corn is flat. So what's going on here? What happened? What did biofuel policies do? And I'm going to argue that biofuel policy defined as 2 things: environmental regulations and energy policy. Also, agricultural policy, that's a different issue. Okay, so what happened after? What happened in September 2006? Why did I end in September 2006? Well, okay, this is why. All of a sudden, prices shot up in October of 2006. But look at this. What is this? This blue line is ethanol production capacity. It was about to double. And this data is on the internet. And 2/3 of the way through the year, all of a sudden the market realized, where are they going to get all this corn to process as ethanol? Okay, and so what we had was farm price of corn up 88%. The number 2 white corn was up 107%. That precipitated the Mexico tortilla crisis in the next month of January. February, India had a wheat import, that's an export ban, I'm sorry, that should be export ban. And then in the end of 2007, the United States doubled their mandate. What I'm trying to say is that biofuel policies were instrumental in causing the food, grain, oilseed price increase, because if corn goes up, wheat and rice are going to go up, soybeans go up. So it was instrumental. And it was two policies, an environmental regulation and an energy policy. High oil prices activated a tax credit that was in place in 1978, but it was dormant because it never paid to use ethanol as a fuel, only as an additive, but never as a fuel. But the biofuel policy, the form of energy environmental policies, linked crop prices to ethanol prices or biofuel prices for the first time, and now they're locked in, and we have a whole new ball game. Okay, so I'll just end there. You want to sit up here? Sure.
Any clarification questions? Okay, well then, I'll continue. Okay. I'd like to have sort of sufficient time for discussions with participants. So I'd like to just only raise a few questions for that, to the two presentations. Regarding this evaluation of understanding the current situation for energy, food, nutrition, and climate change, a presentation made by Dr. Todd Gott's similar. Well, yes, I understand that it's important to increase the research and development budget to cope with this issue, to release the constraint on land and water. So I wonder what kind of well, she discussed at the latter part of her presentation what areas should get attention. But I understand that IFPRI has been conducting studies, especially led by the Director General of Schengen Fund, regarding what areas of public spending should be emphasized for the purpose of agriculture and rural development. So I wonder whether IFPRI has been doing studies in terms of identifying the priority areas in terms of public spending. The budget is limited in developing countries, also even for developed countries. So yes, we know that many areas should get attention and then should have priorities. But what areas should get the most priority in terms of getting the allocation of public spending? Okay, regarding the Professor Tu, he didn't really verbally say, but in his slide, he laid out what should be done as a next step in terms of academic research. So he was proposing to set up a model making a distinction between developing countries and then developed countries. So what kind of like a characterization should we have for developed economies and then developing countries in his model? And then if we were to, specifically talk about the situation of the United States and Japan as example of developed economies in North America and Asia, how should we characterize these economies in his model? Industrial structures might be different for the US and Japan. So I have a question regarding these distinctions for these two economies. Okay, so these are my brief questions. So I would like to ask Professor Tu, and then similar to come up to the here to join the general discussions. I'd like to open the discussions to the floor. We have 20 to 25 minutes for general discussions. So you can just raise your hands. I see the hands over there. This time, we might ask you to come up to the microphone over here to ask questions. And then, I wish to collect questions, but with this method of collecting answers, maybe just it's easier that we individually respond. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you each for your presentations. I have a question which sort of applies to each of you in turn, and that's the question of, so the primary issue of climate change is one of volatility, and that weather becomes more volatile, it becomes more difficult to predict, and conditions become harder to adapt to over time. So borrowing a sort of traditional investment strategy of diversification, I wonder if there's maybe not policies that both mitigate and adapt. So for instance, with respect to agriculture, you discussed crops that are more resilient to new pathogens. So my suggestion is more crop diversification, because for instance, in the United States, you have this enormous monopoly of, for instance, corn. In the transportation sector, we have 90% of the US transportation sector is petroleum dependent. So the question is, do we become more resilient to climate change and volatility if we have a diversified fleet of electric, natural gas, petroleum, and perhaps fuel cells or other forms of energy for vehicles? And so my suggestion is also that instead of sort of a single-minded focus towards renewables, we focus on a more diversified electricity portfolio of natural gas, nuclear, wind, solar, and other energy systems that arise. And so my question was with respect to agriculture and energy, do you think that that sort of policy might be more effective than a technology-driven policy? And for Dr. Tsur, if that would be more effective as both mitigation and adaptive strategies?
Okay. Do you want to collect questions or should I respond?
Any related questions in this area? Oh, okay.
I have two questions for Professor Tsur. One, in your neoclassical economic model, do you wind up assuming a conventional discount rate? There's been a huge fight about discount rates, and in particular, that on a century, 2-century time scale, why don't you use a small one? And I think you're using a standard one, but let me know. And the second one, which is related to one of the questions that was asked already, is if you have a highly inhomogeneous country, i.e., let's say a very well-developed coastal region and a very poorly developed interior region, so there's interchange between the interior and exterior, how does that change your model?
Any other questions? Well then, I would ask
regarding the first question, as I mentioned, you call it volatility. I use the term uncertainty, but the two overlap, though they're not exactly the same concept. And definitely diversification is a way to deal with volatility and fluctuations. But the way I see it, it's more of an adaptive policy. You don't try to affect the volatility, but you try to respond to it. So by diversifying your portfolio, diversifying your crops or whatever, so that when the volatility, the fluctuations are realized, the effect, the potential damage or effect is reduced. So the way I see it, it's a more of an adaptive approach. The preventive approach would be to try to change volatility. That is, affect the process of accumulation of greenhouse gases, which is what we've been doing mostly, or trying to do, not very successful. So, and at the end, what we'd like to do is we'd like to balance these two types of policies, and this, to my knowledge, has not been done in a comprehensive, in a satisfactory way, simply because we were focusing too much on mitigation and not enough on adaptation, and to a lesser extent on tying the two together. So I think the real challenge for the near future is looking at a comprehensive framework, taking into account all the different motives that are playing out here for different, the spatial, the geographical, the different incentive for different countries. We have to take that into account. But this has not been done. And the main message of my presentation was exactly that. So I focus more on the adaptation because this has been overlooked and ignored. But at the end, I say we have to look at both. And diversification is definitely one approach, which the way I see it is a more of an adaptive type of policy. So this is the first question. The second question, the main debate and discussion over climate policies, at least in the economic arena, have been centered on the discount rate. And in this approach, in the model that I present here, we take the constant discount rate. We don't commit to any particular one. The main debate surrounding particularly the Stern review was, should we discount at 1%, 4%, or maybe 6%? And when you look at long-term consequences, these small differences make huge difference in the policies that we should undertake. So those that, for instance, those that are in favor of discounting it, say 5-6%, which is more or less what we do in say the way we look at the guidelines for different governments of how to what kind of discount rate to use in public projects. Those are the type of numbers we get. And if we look at the long perspective, we get a result that we shouldn't do much in the near term, the so-called the gradual ramp, which is Nordhaus is a person that favors that. So we shouldn't do much in the near and medium term, and we should do more vigorous policies of mitigating greenhouse gas emission in the longer term, after maybe 30, 40 years. Whereas Stern said we should discount at a much lower rate, which means we should start mitigating and abating and reducing greenhouse gas emission right away. So that's the main. Here we do, and then there is an in-between approach, which say we should discount the near future at a certain rate, and then look at the medium and longer term discount at a lower rate. In this framework, we looked at the constant discount, right, without committing to any particular level. So it's more kind of a conceptual. But this is definitely a very important parameter in the model, though in the framework that we do here for adaptive policies, it is less of its effect is less pronounced. It's not as effective as it is for mitigation policies. So,
Yeah, sort of homogeneity, or how would you develop both?
yeah, so the adaptive policies, one of the the main motivation for the adaptive policies is the heterogeneity of countries, the spatial variability of countries due to geographic conditions, and that some countries stand to benefit from climate change, like I think Canada may even enjoy it, and other countries will suffer a little bit, will benefit a little bit, and some countries will suffer a lot. So the heterogeneity of this, due to the spatial variability, is what drives the need to, or the motives, bring about the main incentives for preemptive actions for each country on its own, and undermines the concerted effort, international efforts that is being comes about via the various international treaties, that we see how hard it is to ratify them, and then once they're ratified and approved, to implement them. And I have no solution for that. I just bring the reasons why I think the reasons why it is so hard to implement this type of policies. And if we understand that, we may be able to come up with better approaches and design better treaties that would be more robust and more implementable, better implementable.
Well, empirical studies found that discount rates for developing economies tend to be much higher than for developing countries, much higher than the developed countries' discount rates. So you might be able to sort of modify your discount rates according to the levels of development.
That's true, because the discount rate is also affected by the rate of growth of a country. Developing economies grow much faster, and that affects the way they discount the future, and that affects all the perspective and policies associated with, particularly long-term policies that have a long-term effect. And this is very important, which ties into the issues of discussion of how the effect of the discount rate, and economists are predominantly bothered with discount rates in this policy debate, climate change policy debate. I think the discount rate, I've not looked at it too deeply, but I think it has less of an effect in the type of models that I present here, if we look at the adaptation policies. But when we come to tie the two together, they will come back. They will definitely be very influential, discount rates.
Dr. Simler, you have
Okay, so the first question that the gentleman asked regarding the diversification of renewable energy and crops. Yes, I lived in Iowa for a long time, so I can understand the corn and soybean and how they are dominant, but in the end, for farmers, it makes sense for them to plant them because it's more profitable for them. So in order to generate that crop diversity, you need to change the economic incentives for the farmers, and you need to change agricultural policy components of it. So I don't know how that could be done within a certain political system. So it's not something very easy to achieve, I think. And there's a reason that they are planting corn and soybean. So it's very difficult to change those. And also it's the same thing for the electric cars, for example, you mentioned. You can provide consumers with alternatives, but whether they buy them and they use them or not is also going to depend on the relative profitability, the economics of it, whether it makes more sense for them. The electric cars are out there, there's other options out there, there are flex fuel cars out there, but people are just not buying them or using them. So Maybe my fellow panelists might have more comments on those, but I think it's a little bit difficult to change them in the short term. That's what I would say. And regarding your questions a little bit about land and water saving technology and how to induce this type of technological change, I think there's definitely growing interest, but if you look at the developed countries' agricultural R&D investments in real terms, they have either been stable or they have declined. The private sector has picked up a lot of the agricultural R&D, particularly in the US, but they are more interested in commodities or products that they can sell to the market and generate profit from. So bringing back public sector agricultural R&D into the picture would definitely generate a little bit more public goods type thing, but maybe the recent food price crisis have changed how the government see the issue. So, but I just find it a little bit difficult that they'll just change and just start investing in more in agricultural R&D. And the priority area of public spending for R&D, I mean, I should not talk on behalf of IFPRI, but I think the priority areas will be very different for developed and for developing countries. So for US and EU that are major agricultural producers, your crop yields are already high, maybe they are really close to the biophysical yield limit that you might have, and they already have very developed extension systems, rural infrastructure, etc. So for them to increase their agricultural supply, that could be more directed towards like increasing crop productivity and livestock productivity. But for the developing countries, the issues that they face are very, very different. So for them, maybe investment in irrigation, and so that they can increase the agricultural production from the same land, rather than converting new land into agricultural production, that might be a better alternative for them. And for the crop yields, I think their issues are a little bit different. It's about access to different inputs at affordable prices. So maybe their focus should be a little bit more on the extension services to increase farmers' management skills and crop chores and crop patterns, and maybe a little bit more rural infrastructure so that consumers have access to markets at the same time, producers have access to markets so they can sell their products as well. So I think for developed and developed countries, they are very, very different.
Thank you. Any more questions or comments? Yeah, please.
Thank you for your presentation. So I want to ask you about shale gas and biofuel policy changing. So as you know, shale gas has a big change for energy policy, especially in US. So is there any policy change because of shale gas or oil? So how do you think about this problem, this issue? Thank you.
The effect of shale gas has not affected biofuels policy at all that I'm aware of. There's no real interaction between biofuels and shale gas unless shale gas becomes an important transportation fuel such that we break our link with oil prices, but I don't see that in the foreseeable future whatsoever. But I mean, more shale gas. I mean, it all goes down to technology. If we develop new technologies to increase the supply of oil, then we're just going to increase CO2 emissions. Shale oil is a big shale gas. There's a controversy that natural gas from fracking, okay, has emits CO2 equivalent equal to coal. I mean, even EPA admits that's a possibility. Now, there's controversy over that. So the whole issue of technology and global climate change, or CO2 emissions, is complicated. You know, the easier it is to get oil, the more you're going to consume. Same thing for natural gas. So the whole purpose of global climate change is to reduce your consumption. So you got to tax it. Not have technological change that will increase the supplies of. The same thing goes with, I mean, I haven't figured out the details, but we have to be very careful about technological change in agriculture and biofuels. With biofuels, it's a whole new ballgame now. So if you improve the productivity of transforming feedstocks into biofuels, you're going to increase the price of food. That's easy to understand. But what's not easy to understand is not clear what the net effect is. Even if you improve the productivity of land or the yield of corn, you could reduce the cost or increase the supply for feedstock as a biofuel and increase the price of the input. Okay, so it's not, it depends on the demand elasticity and whether the corn price is linked to oil or the mandate's binding, it's not. But the technology and the effect of technology on corn prices are not even clear, given the new world of biofuels. So I just put that as a warning, I guess.
Thank you. Any more questions, comments? All right, please.
I just wanted to offer a follow-up on the issue of corn and why that was such a concern, is that Professor Camp from Stanford University put together some fairly compelling research on showing crop yields under various climate change scenarios. And what he was able to demonstrate is that even with relatively moderate warming over the next century, corn yields slightly increase and then there's a dramatic cutoff. So I would think that would be a good incentive for government to develop a more diversified source of biofuels and foods in agriculture, because it is so susceptible to one of the primary effects of climate change, with nothing to say of droughts and flooding and other potential weather impacts.
Thank you. Good observation.
Just to make a quick comment that just pops up as a result of this comment here. There is climate processes, there is tremendous inertia in climate processes. So even if today we reduce emission of greenhouse gases dramatically, it will take many decades before the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere will stabilize. It will still increase for a long time. So we're going to bear the consequences of whatever we've been doing all so far, even if under the most optimistic scenario we get our act together and reduce emission dramatically, which is unlikely on its own, but just for the sake of the argument. And that's another reason to follow policies that, for instance, the example that this gentleman just gave, which is more of on the adaptive side of the policy sphere.
Okay. Any comments or questions? Professor Tu, Harry asked about some of the assumptions for the price movement and how you selected the model. Would you have any response to those questions? Or how sensitive
if you build a comprehensive model, it should be accounted for. The type of green paradox occur because you model, you fail to model some component of the economy. But if you have a comprehensive approach and you account for everything, then you don't get this type of paradoxes. And for instance, the price of what we call the shadow price of emitting one additional tons of CO2 equivalent or whatever, all comes out of the model when you solve it. Of course, it depends on the assumptions, on the parameters, and so on and so forth. But all the prices come out of the model, and in fact, there are so-called integrated assessment models. There's also large computer-based models that take the economy and combine it with the climate change, with many equations and parameters, and those models can come with all the processes, including the prices, that over time. And if the model is comprehensive enough and is modeled correctly, this phenomenon that Harry referred to should not arise. It should be part of the model itself. And those models do exist. Nordas has a famous model called the DICE, which is an integrated assessment model. The Sterner view is based on another integrated assessment model. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the one that come up every 5 years with a huge, with a big report, has their own integrated assessment model. There's quite a few others that are floating around, and if the model is comprehensive enough and account for all the different processes and effects, it all should be accounted for.
Thank you very much. If you don't have any more questions, then I might wish to conclude this session. Thank you very much for all the contribution of the speakers and discussants, and then also for your involvement for the discussions. Thank you very much for coming to this session. Thank you. We conclude, and then we move to the coffee break. We stay here for 20 minutes, so please have coffee together, and then we discuss more. Thank you.